Hello and welcome to Rolling in Mills. Today we have a horrible film experience. X-Men Apocalypse. Now, I generally do a lot of art house cinema, but that doesn't limit me from enjoying other normal films like, say, the X-Men series or superhero films in general. While I generally don't pay attention to the whole, Marvel, DC, expanded universe, I'm not really, keeping up to date on that, I don't mind it as a whole. I think it's a little bit of, a plague on filmmaking in that you can just kind of keep rehashing some of the same things over and over again. But that's not to say that this trend hasn't actually created some really, really good films, and some of those films are the X-Men films. The issue with this is that X-Men Apocalypse sucks my nuts. It's fucking terrible. And it's terrible in ways I couldn't have even imagined. I hadn't kept up with any of the trailers or any sort of information around this, but I generally liked First Class and Days of Future Past. I thought they were very, very solid films, some of the better superhero films I've seen. They'd probably be in the top 3, though I guess the holy grail is X-Men 2, which is just a really, really solid action film. And that's all it has to be, just a really, really solid film in itself. It doesn't have to belong to any sort of genre, it just happens to be a superhero film. But X-Men Apocalypse is almost as bad as Last Stand, I'd say, quality level. Last Stand is worse from, a fanbase level, as far as I'm aware, because it ruins a lot of, really, really important things. And on top of that, it's terrible generally. But this is, I cannot believe that Bryan Singer made this. And I feel like it has to be some sort of, studio involvement or something went wrong in the production to make this film this bad. And if you're worried about this is going to be a spoiler-free review, and I'm going to go into spoilers, but you're going to be able to skip them. So before I get ahead of myself, the basic plot is Oscar Isaac, famed for Drive and Ex Machina, but probably more famously and more recently, Star Wars The Force Awakens, as the first mutant in the world, who is apparently the foundation for many religious myths and biblical myths, and he apparently created the pyramids, and basically follows him reawakening from 3,000 years slumber to go and blow up the world. And that's a pretty interesting concept, and as far as I'm aware, it's actually covered pretty well in the comics, and he's a pretty main villain there, but here it's man. And I keep getting ahead of myself because I can't even begin to explain how bad everything is. To give an emphasis without spoilers, every single scene has something that is, severely wrong with it on some level, be it the script being terrible, which it generally is. A lot of the dialogue here is very, very on the nose, and by that I mean characters saying, "Ah, yes, but you are the most powerful person I know," or, "Hey, remember when this exact thing happened?" And it's they're literally explaining word for word what has happened previously in the plot, or some sort of little MacGuffin thing, and it's just oh, it's painful to listen to. On top of that, the acting swaps from solid to, melodramatic to the point of being really funny. Do not give away any spoilers furthermore, I just want to be really careful and really emphasizing that. There's a scene in which Michael Fassbender as Magneto is screaming to the sky, asking, "What have you forsaken me, God?" or something along those lines, and it feels like a scene out of Macbeth, the Macbeth film he did, except the high school version. It's shocking, and I was really trying to hold down laughter in the theater, even though there were only about 7 people there. On top of that, right from the beginning, this is just a CGI fest to the worst degree. I'm not sure if I'd rank it to the same degree as the Transformers films, but it's getting there. It's really, really close. The opening scene alone is basically just 15 minutes of just things collapsing into CGI structures and CGI everything, and basically 100% computer-generated scenes. And the thing is that some of them aren't particularly good, and I was noticing this right from the beginning of the film, and it really, really becomes noticeable towards the end. There is some shockingly bad CGI in this, and there are parts of the film where it was unacceptable level of quality. On top of that, you have some really, really, really shoddy green screen, to the point where you can faintly see the green glow of it coming from the back of people's heads, and I'm how is this in the final cut of this film? It's madness. The plot is just, it's incomprehensible, and that's to actually give the plot the privilege of being there, because there is no plot. There's about 35 minutes worth of exposition, and I'm really not using hyperbole there. The film sets up about 5 different backstories simultaneously, but none of them are really linked to each other, and none of them actually, like, start the plot, per se. Like, the film opens with ancient Egypt and Apocalypse, but then it stops to Mystique, and then it stops to, like, that CIA agent Moira, whatever her name is, she's, like, digging around in Egypt, and then it's, like, it stops to other people, but none of it's connected, and it's only just starting to build up, and it's just, like, you're focusing on, like, 5 or 6 things at once, but the plot hasn't started, and it's introducing, like, a bunch of new characters, and you're like, what is going on? But then it doesn't develop from there, and then the film starts focusing on one thing and then completely shifts to another thing that's totally different, and it just has absolutely no focus to a degree that really defines the word lack of focus. It feels like a child playing, like, with their toys in just, like, random, like, play scenes, you know, in their mind. They're thinking, oh, it'd be cool if this happened, or this happened, and then someone was sitting down and then just put all of that in a film in chronological order, and, like, that's the final film. On top of that, there's some, like, shockingly bad tonal switches in the film, and by that I mean it kind of has, like, Star Wars prequel syndrome, in which it goes from happy moment to, oh, tense moment to scared, and then sad, and then it's just jumping all around the place, and you just have no idea what to do emotionally, because you're like, you're tugging me in all these different directions, please guide me, because filmmaking should really, like, guide the audience through emotion, through the plot, through the arcs of the characters. And on the point of arcs of characters, as mentioned previously, there's a lot of characters in this film, and just a lot of things going on generally. Like, it's fine for your film to be complex, but this crosses the boundary into convoluted. It's not even complex, it's just confusing, and there is just way too much going on in this film. It feels like the third act happens about 4 times, and then when the third act actually happens, it takes up, like, half the film, which actually kind of feels like a Transformers film, because all of those films have, like, boring setup for half the film and then just mindless action. And funnily enough, one of the people I saw this with actually got a migraine from the film. And the weird thing is, I'm talking about the CGI stuff, but First Class and Days of Future Past weren't, like, really CGI reliant, from memory at least. I mean, it was nowhere close to what they're doing right now, and it was generally used, like, sparingly enough that it totally works for the plot, and you're like, okay, that is a completely fine use of CGI. Here it's just you're being beaten in the face with this just, like, 2012-esque destruction porn, and there's this one shot, and if you've seen the film you know what I'm talking about, hopefully, of a series of shipping containers that are getting blown up, and they look like unrendered 3D models, and I was gawking at this in the theatre. It was like, how did you put that in the film? You can't do that. You can't have that sort of stuff. It looks like a video game from, like, 1970, and video games didn't really even exist in the 1970s, at least with 3D stuff. I mean, I gotta really emphasize, everything is wrong. Editing is wrong. Color is wrong. Somehow, this film is so oversaturated, it feels like a cartoon. And it even has, like, cartoon logic with some of the physics as well, where it's like, oh, it's piercing to the eyes. It feels like someone just went into the editing software, went and just looked at the saturation bar, and then just ramped it up like 500%. And I think Marvel films do this a little bit, like, from memory, Guardians of the Galaxy really popped out at you visually, but the whole film kind of had that, like, style to it, and it felt very normal for it. With this, there are scenes in, like, Auschwitz where it has that color spectrum, and you're like, that doesn't fit, please don't do that, that's bad. Or, like, dramatic scenes, and everything's, like, really brightly lit and colourful. It's bizarre. It's like aliens descended from Earth and tampered with this film. So that's basically, like, all I can say without going into spoilers, because a lot of this is, like, every single scene has this little thing, and there's so much to talk about, and not so much nitpick, because a lot of the complaints here are very legitimate. They just happen to be examples of these legitimate complaints in every single field of filmmaking. So I'm going to go into spoilers now. Skip here if you do not want to see them, and it'll take you just to the end of the review where I'm giving my final summation and score, and yeah. Okay, so into spoilers now. Far out. I mean, okay, I don't think I emphasized this. I literally just got back from this film roughly 15 minutes ago, and this is fully ad-libbed. What the fuck was that? I was seriously amazed in the theater, and I feel like I actually need to watch this again because I can't believe this is a studio release. And before I started filming this, I quickly looked at like the aggregate reviews. People were giving this like pretty solid scores, like 60s and 70s, and it's like, are you serious? Like, did we see the same film? Okay, what was with all of those scenes with Oscar Isaac as Apocalypse in the opening in Egypt? It feels like the film is trying to be like a really black comedy, but it's playing it completely straight. But the color spectrum feels like a light-hearted family comedy. I mentioned Guardians of the Galaxy before. That's like a light-hearted space adventure about friendship and that sort of thing. And it's very, very comedic. And it's even more comedic than most of the regular Marvel stuff. With this, it's like, and if you haven't seen the film and you are still watching this, and I'll kind of explain the scene. Apocalypse has just woken up after like, 4,000, 5,000 years. And he's walking around modern Egypt in this enormous cloak. He's like 9 foot tall, looks like a fucking blueberry, and has this crazy like ancient Egyptian aliens tech on him. And he's just kind of like waddling around. And I was like, holding back laughter because it feels like a comedic sequence, like, oh haha, like the crazy alien dude is really out of his depth and he's like, in modern society, whoa, starring Brendan Fraser, yeah. But it's played straight. And then there's another scene in which Apocalypse teleports Magneto because, of course, he can teleport everywhere and he has godly powers, which, by the way, aren't really explained well enough to kind of give credence to his ability or the sort of trials that the heroes will have to kind of get over to stop him, because he's basically at godhood. So it kind of raises the question, why can't he just, like, flatten the Earth himself? Like, what? But he teleports Magneto to Auschwitz and says, you know, here is where your powers are birthed. You know, there's that scene, which is actually really, really good in First Class. That whole opening section in Auschwitz is actually handled pretty well, where Magneto is bending the iron gates of the concentration camp. But it's like, they're in Auschwitz, and obviously that's some like really, really heavy shit to deal with. And there's these like crazy, colourful, like massive blueberry mutant characters just like standing in the middle of Auschwitz, and I'm like, oh my god, really? Like, are you really doing that? Like, are you serious right now? And there's another scene later which I actually kind of thought was like the third act all of a sudden, where Apocalypse Now... Did I just call him Apocalypse Now? Fuck, I'm leaving that in. Where Apocalypse kind of hacks into Charles' mind when he's using the, like, cerebral brain thing. And he then takes over, like, a bunch of people in the world and starts shooting nukes up. And I'm like, oh my god, is he gonna, like, blow up the Earth? Like, this scene kind of comes out of nowhere. And it just starts with Charles just talking with some people and then trying to find Magneto and kind of talk to him. But then the scene's suddenly happening and there's all this crazy music going on. And, you know, it's getting really, really intense. These nukes start firing. And it starts playing Beethoven's Seventh, which is like... okay, you can only use this so many times. As a side note, this happens to be my favorite classical piece of all time. I think it's extraordinary. It's absolutely beautiful. And what they do with it is both contextually terrible, and they also rape it several times. It goes from that beautiful ballad in the second movement, the dun 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 dun, you know the one. And it turns it into this like techno dubstep track. It's like, oh my god, stop, you're raping Beethoven. It's horrible. And these nukes go up in the air, and they're just kind of sitting outside the Earth's orbit, and I'm like, oh my god, okay, so he's gonna like turn them back in on the Earth and blow up the entire Earth because he wants to like, you know, cleanse the human race to have mutants come back in. And it just randomly cuts back to, like, the X-Men facility, and Charles is just talking with someone, and it's like, the tension just stops, and Beethoven's Seventh stops, and it's like, what about the nukes? What's happening with that? Are people forgetting about this? And then the film just kind of progresses, and I kind of forgot about it, but for a while I'm like, is that still a thing? Should I be caring about the nukes in the air? What's happening with that? And then in a later scene, someone just offhandedly mentions, like, oh yeah, Apocalypse shot all the missiles up in the air so he'd rid humanity of their nukes. But it, like, isn't explained in the scene at all. So that was, like, for real confusing. And the people I was talking with later were also like, what the fuck was with that scene? And just about every other scene in the film. But the thing is, immediately after that, it kind of goes into that dialogue sequence. And then the film kind of tries to copy that actually really, really good sequence with Quicksilver in Days of Future Past, which is, like, definitely the highlight of that. Just a really, like, fun scene. A really nice callback to, like, a simpler time in action films where you're like, hey, that's cool, that's, like, a cool superpower, and then you just kind of explore that. It's neat, it's not too crazy over the top CGI, it's, like, a great usage of that effect, and great Perfect scene. And they completely ruin it here. They basically ruin it by the fact that they know that people like it, and then coming back to it, it makes it instantly uncool. I don't really know how to handle that situation, because people always say, oh no, give us more, give us more, give us more, that scene was really good. And then the second time they deliver, I don't think it can ever really live up to that, like, unexpected greatness of that initial scene. But it's this, like, weird slapstick comedy scene where the entire Xavier mansion is exploding and Quicksilver is going around saving people, and there's, like, this crazy slapstick with, like, a dog eating pizza, and he's, like, throwing it out the window, and it's like, I was talking about tonal shifts before, that is, like, being smacked over the head with a tonal shift. It's like, oh, dramatic, oh my god, what's happening with the nukes, to, what's happening with the nukes, to, is this a comedy sequence? And I actually forgot to mention that during that really, really intense Beethoven 7th nuke sequence, it just randomly cuts to, like, a Stan Lee cameo. That's like, oh, hey, that's like a neat Easter egg thing there. But it's like, during this sequence, like, inexplicable. Crazy. And just from there, it's like, it's just, everything is basically just terrible from there. I feel exhausted even beginning to mention it. Ironically, there is a very, very fan service heavy cameo from Wolverine that just is, like, completely random in the film, and by that point I'm just like, this is just abysmal, like, far out. And the scene itself is just, like, you know, it's really, really obvious fan service. It has, like, no real structure in the film itself. But the scene is actually, like, really fantastic. It's really well choreographed. It's great. It's really intense. I think something that I've always been kind of annoyed by is how tame a lot of the stuff with Wolverine is, because, you know, full on impales people. And there's, like, a little bit of that in the beginning of X-Men 2 in, like, the opening scene. He just full on stabs a guy in the chest, and it's like, oh my god, Wolverine's here. And then in some of the later films, as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen the most recent Wolverine film that came out. I've seen X-Men Origins Wolverine, which is, let me tell you, that's not a very good film. But in a lot of the other ones, it's like off-screen blood, and I really can't be worried because the first kill that he commits in this cameo in Apocalypse is off-screen, and I'm like, oh my god, you're gonna, like, spend all this time, like, bringing out Wolverine, having this really contrived plot, basically, and then not, like, utilize him properly. And by the way, I should contextualize this. Wolverine is, like, post-adamantium. He's in the Stryker Institution by this point, and basically the entire scene is just him murdering all of Stryker's men. And from there it just, like, goes into, like, full-on bloody massacre, and it isn't, you know, as untamed as I'd like it to be, but they really go full out, and you can kind of feel, like, the passion and the interest they had in that scene. And I mean, if that's, like, Hugh Jackman's last appearance as Logan, then that's a pretty good way to go out. Though I will mention that there is a young, like, Scott Summers here, Cyclops dude with the eyeball lasers, and the end of the scene is Phoenix, redhead, Sansa from Game of Thrones, whatever her name is. She helps Wolverine, like, settle down because she's a psychic, and then he runs off and she kind of wipes his memory a little bit. And Cyclops, who is obviously, like, the foil for Wolverine in the actual X-Men series, is like, well, I hope we don't see any more of him again. Wink wink. It's like talk about on the nose, like, stabbing through the nose. It's like a nose piercing with, like, a fucking harpoon. And it really put, like, a sour tinge to the scene for me. I was just kind of like, bleh, 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 bleh. And I actually didn't mention this earlier, but the film really, really constantly uses flashbacks to X-Men First Class. And this is where this kind of idea where I was saying that it feels like some sort of producer involvement or some kind of higher power was like, oh my god, people aren't going to understand what's happening from First Class. First Class was like, what, 2011, 2012? People aren't going to remember that. We got to put all these flashbacks in. And they do it, like, 4 times, I think, and it's really, really obnoxious and kind of confusing as well, because they kind of expect you to know who certain characters are, which I did know because I remember the films relatively well, but then they only do flashbacks to First Class, and then Stryker randomly turns up, who's set up, like, right at the end of Days of Future Past, and everyone kind of acts like they know who they are, but I kind of forgot who the fuck he was, and I'm like, what's happening? What? And so that's kind of confusing. Even though they did it, they didn't really do it at the same time. So it's like, Just briefly, Nightcrawler. Okay, the one thing of promotional imagery I saw was that one poster that everyone got up in arms about because the costumes looked terrible. They're pretty bad in the film. Beast is like neon blue the entire film, and the costume looks like pretty fake, but none of it is as bad as it's shown in the poster, which is ironic because it really should be like the other way around, that the promotional image has been like touched up and they spent a lot of time on the makeup, because it's like your opinion on what these characters look like is based on this one image, but in the film it can kind of be like a bit, yeah, you know, whatever. In the film it's actually substantially better, and it doesn't look like they did any like CGI touch-ups to it, though it's totally possible that they did. But I really expected to hate Nightcrawler's character a lot more. His design is terrible. The whole like weird blue highlight thing, for one, doesn't really fit the 80s as a setting as far as I'm aware, and two, I don't know how that fits his character in the slightest. He's like this kind of like gothic demon, super religious guy that's in a circus. Why does he have this like super hipster hair flourish thing? It's like, But his character is actually one of the only semi-enjoyable parts of the film from a like comedic standpoint. Second part, James McAvoy as Professor X, yet again, does a really, really good job with the crap he's handed. To be fair, he hasn't had as much crap as other people like Michael Fassbender. God damn. For one, there's this entire backstory for Michael Fassbender having like this family. He's living in Poland, and Dzień dobry, any Polish people watching this, but mi nie rozumiem this entire fucking part of the film because it's pointless. It establishes that Magneto has been kind of living undercover. He has a wife, he has a kid, and then, you know, he saves someone from a workplace accident using his powers, and then, you know, complications happen, his wife and kid accidentally die, and then he somehow becomes vengeful against humanity again. Okay. And, like, this is one of those, like, early subplots I was talking about in the film, where it's just setting stuff up and you're like, where is this going? You haven't told me what the plot is. I don't fucking care. You gotta give me some drive. And then apparently this is meant to like explain why Magneto becomes vengeful for humanity. I always thought that was like a majorly integral part of his character from like his origin story. And you didn't need to be like, hey, here's your fake family. We're killing them now. Because as soon as I saw his child come on screen, I'm like, you're fucking dead. We're gonna have to waste like 20 minutes on this or some bullshit. And then it's weird because, and this is a pretty common trend throughout the film, characters just like randomly having arcs that don't have any effect on the story. There's no reason to include it, and I cannot believe it wasn't cut from the script because Magneto doesn't even have an important role later in the film. It kind of sets it up because we spend a lot of time with him to begin with. But then it's like, oh, he actually doesn't do anything. And his character change is just totally random and unexplained, basically. Like, it kind of makes sense, but it's like, he doesn't have to go through any real change. He basically makes up his mind that, oh, I want to kill people, and then someone's like, no, don't do it, and he goes, okay, that's the arc. And then you have other arcs, like Quicksilver trying to deal with the fact that he has to tell Magneto that he's actually his dad, which doesn't really go anywhere at all. And also him feeling like, oh, he's like too slow for things, even though he's really fast, which probably sounded like a really, really cool like duality for the writer, but it just comes across as like super tacky and not really in character at all. And on top of that, most of the comedic scenes that he has, while he's pretty good in Days of Future Past, and I don't blame the actor here at all, it's mainly the dialogue, it's mainly the editing even. The editing is just, it's just like, it's trying to edit comedically, but everything's wrong. It's just cutting at the wrong time. It doesn't have that feel to it, you know, when you edit something, when you edit a scene, it has like that internal like mechanism of time and logic in it, and basically every scene is completely missing that. And it's not like they were missing the shots, even though I feel like they actually were missing a few like cutaways at times, because the film gets so hectic towards the end and there's so much going on for all these different characters. It would probably lengthen the film by like half an hour to have like all these establishing shots and totally different things for different characters entering and leaving locations and such. Just completely random arcs that have nothing to do with anything, don't achieve anything towards the story, don't really add that much to the character that could have been actually legitimately explored with a much, much smaller troupe of characters. And I really strongly get the feeling that this is like a franchise setter, because as far as I'm aware, there's that whole like big arc in X-Men where the Phoenix character, Jean Grey, she goes like supernova or whatever and she blows up the world and there's all the Sentinels or something. That's like a really important part of it, and I feel like they're basically trying to introduce the fresh blood in this film while simultaneously trying to make another film with like the original X-Men, and it just doesn't glue together because you've got all these different characters, all these different plot threads that are just going nowhere, and character arcs that are going nowhere. Like, seriously feels like this film was like a really, really rushed, completely underplanned, completely confusingly shot, and I would absolutely kill and love to know what sort of shit went down on set, because it really feels like something went down. On top of this, I'd like to mention, just closing, this has some of the worst case of like, we're on a small soundstage with a massive green screen on it. And you might not know what I mean, but there's a few shots of like characters sitting on like rocks in terrain, and you can tell that they're just sitting in like this little, like, I don't know, 5x5 meter room that someone's just chucked some like pebbles in, you know. They're sitting down, and then it's just this like really, really bad green screen effect. One scene I'm thinking of in particular is where it's like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and Charles are sitting on this rock outside Egypt. And there's this one shot of Michael Fassbender, and it's like, it looks like they haven't like properly rendered the green screen. It's like blurry between the divide in his skin and the background. And there's other shots where it's like a character is in focus in the foreground, and they're obviously green screen behind them, which, you know, green screen is totally fine. All of the CGI stuff, I like to really reiterate, can be used, and is used quite a few times really, really well. Funnily enough, take another Oscar Isaac film, Ex Machina. CGI is used perfectly there, really accentuates the story, and isn't distracting in the slightest. But there's a few shots where it's like characters in focus in the foreground with like a shallow depth of field, you know, and then the background far behind them is also in focus. They've just taken a crystal clear in focus image of it and then just pasted it on the green screen behind them, so your eye is like, wait, both things are in foreground, and it looks like a matte shot. Insane. I don't know, it's like a bunch of amateurs made the film. I don't know what else to say. This film was actually somewhat broken me. I really didn't expect it to be this bad going into it. Like, wow. I would say it's almost worth watching for how bad it is, and I might take like a look at it again, like just scroll through it to watch certain scenes again, because it's like, you could even re-edit this film and it would go, you know, a couple of points up from what I'm going to give it. Not that many, but I feel like there are ways you could rearrange these shots to make them slightly better. God. And I just keep on forgetting so many things. This film has like the texture and frame rate of like a YouTube fan film at points. I mean, okay, the costumes are pretty fucking terrible at points, and they look really bad in some shots compared to others. Like, you look at the Mystique costume in this and like First Class and Days of Future Past, and it's like, okay, obviously Jennifer Lawrence doesn't like the whole full body thing because apparently it's allergic for her skin or something, as far as I've heard, so whatever. But it just gives off this like really amateurish vibe, but it didn't bother me so much back then. It's kind of irritating, but it's like, whatever, you can get over it, you know. As long as the story is really driving you through, then it's totally okay, and that was really the case with First Class and Days of Future Past. The story is really strong, pulls you through the film despite the flaws. And that's basically what any good film should do, because every film has flaws. The frame rate in certain scenes, I feel it's either at like 30 FPS or 60 FPS. If you don't know what that means, like, okay, films are at 24 frames a second, which gives a certain like blur to the image. TV shows are at 25 FPS, which gives it like a slightly faker but more natural look. But the more frames you have per second, the clearer the image will be and the less blur there'll be in shots. And so a lot of people like to play video games at like 30 or 60 FPS, especially for shooters, because when you're tracking along with your gun or whatever, you want to be able to see everything crystal clear with no blur. And if you remember, there was that whole like debacle around Peter Jackson wanting to shoot the Hobbit films in 24 FPS, and he actually did, and then people were like vomiting everywhere because it doesn't feel real. Like, when you blur your head, when you turn your head in real life, there is a certain blur to things, and it feels really weird to the brain when there isn't that blur. I mean, for one, the film is probably shot on digital. I imagine it has the look of it, but I could be wrong on that. Or at least some scenes are shot digitally. But it feels like half the shots are in 60 FPS. And it feels like a YouTube video and not this like filmic experience. And I think that's really important to note, because a lot of the shots here are like grandiose, cinema span, Lawrence of Arabia, massive epic scale. But it looks like this like crappy little like video quality. I don't know what the like artistic decision behind that is, or if I'm completely mistaken and totally wrong on this, but I don't think I am, because it was really bugging me for the entire film. And if it wasn't the entire film, then it was specifically the Stryker compound scene that it was like really noticeable. And the funny thing is, like, there's all these shots happening in the film, like Logan, you know, killing people, and it cuts to a computer monitor and his face comes up in the frame, and for one, it's this really like awkwardly comedic image And two, the video monitor is displaying at like the same FPS as the actual film you're watching, so it just looks really weird to the brain. So that's it, and those are my thoughts on the film. It's just abysmal, and I mean, like, wow. I was expecting this to be like slightly worse than Days of Future Past, from the concept of this like apocalyptic god trying to destroy the earth or whatever. I don't find those plots interesting, particularly. Like, First Class has this like really simple, interesting revenge story that has like bigger political consequences. Days of Future Past is still another like simple story, despite having huge consequences for like multiple timelines and whatever. This is like the most ridiculous, ill-explained consequences that are just handled so poorly. Everything is terrible, basically. And I mean, and some scenes do stand out, and there are some moments that are legitimately good, legitimately funny, legitimately well acted, interesting, whatever, but I mean, they're seriously drowned out in crap. I'm feeling a 34 on this one, and I feel like that's actually being a little generous. So those are my thoughts on it. I feel like a lot of people are going to disagree with me to some degree on this, but I mean, man, just watch the film again. I would love to probe your brain and really know how you've come to the opinions you have. And it's possible, hey, maybe it's because I haven't read the source material. Even so, I don't think you should need to have extensive comic book knowledge to make a crap film better. And I mean, fundamentally, and even like technically, this film is like objectively poor, because this film is like fundamentally flawed on basically every level. So if you want to see any of my other stuff, I have reviewed The Force Awakens. I did a very similar kind of discussion thing with this where it was straight out of the theater, lots of high energy. I think it's one of the better reviews I've made. If you want to see a review for something a little more art house, check out the Aguirre, The Wrath of God review. That is a fantastic Werner Herzog film. Highly recommend checking that out. And yeah, au revoir.